All right, welcome back. And now that we've got our staring contest video game here, which is terrible to be perfectly honest, um, let's look at how we can make this a little more interesting, how we can actually take this player and control it, because really that's what we want to do in the end. So after we've added a bunch of the basic things, these nodes that get created, we can save them as scenes. If we want to have some more control over them, this is where we need to get into our programming. So I'm going to open up my player scene. And to program our objects or our scenes, if you will, or the things in our game, we basically take a node that we want to have some programming on, and we add or attach a what's called a script. And a script is essentially um, instructions to the computer on how this thing is going to behave. And so let's get started. We'll talk a little bit about the scripting language and how this works. So when I have a node that I want, the player in this case, to attach a script to, there's a little button right up here that says attach a new or existing script to that. So I'm just going to click this, and it'll come up with a little bit of some options to choose from. The language you're going to be using is GDScript. This is basically Python. If you are familiar with other programming languages, if not, that's okay. We're going to learn it as we go along. The inherits here, this is something you're probably never going to change. This is basically saying, well, the character body 2D, that's the node we made the player with, it comes with some scripting already. That's kind of the advantage of using a game design engine, is that Godot has already done some of the programming and made available some of the instructions that would be common to this character body. So the ability to move, the ability to show it, the ability to have collisions and things like that. So it's basically saying take all of the code that somebody else wrote, it's all hidden away, you're never going to need to see it, and make it available to this thing. Down here we've got a template. Now, with Godot 4, they've actually done a lot of programming for you. So in fact, they're saying it's pretty common to have some kind of player that bounces around. So we can give you all of the programming that you want. In this case, I don't think it's going to be very helpful because we may want to change some things. It also doesn't really help us learn how this stuff works, and it's a little overwhelming at the beginning. So I want to start right from scratch. So I'm going to click here, and I'm just going to say, I want the default programming. That'll give me just a couple little bits there that I can use, but not too much stuff. Uh, and what's going to happen is it's going to create a script as a separate file, a lot like the things we've got appearing down here. This one's just going to be called player.gd. Notice the player scene is player.tscn for a scene file. This is a GD script file. So we get lots of different files, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to create that folder there. So just hit, the only thing you've got to change here is that node default and hit create. And up comes our programming environment. And if you've done any programming before, this should look pretty familiar. You've got a bunch of numbers here for lines. You've got a bit of programming already, and we'll talk a little bit about each part of this as we go along. So the first line of code, that was that thing we said extends or inherits character body 2D. And so we don't want to touch that line there. This basically means take all of the programming that's hidden in the background and make sure it's available here. We've got a couple empty spaces here. Line 4 has got a little hashtag in front of it. And whenever you see that little hashtag, this is what's called a comment. And a comment is something that's ignored by the computer, but it's a handy little note either for yourself or for other programmers to leave messages to yourself. So in this case, Godot has given it to us and said, hey, this is what this thing does. So this is called when the node enters the scene tree for the first time. Basically, the next line it's saying, we've got two sections here. One's called the ready section, func ready, and the other one's called func process. The ready section happens once when the node starts in the scene. So this is really common for things that you want to do to initialize your player. Maybe give it some health, give it lives, give it some power, erase something, put it in a particular position on the screen. That's what this section's for, the section that happens once, usually at the beginning of the game or the beginning of when the scene gets loaded. The second section, you can see here, there's a little note called every frame, and we're not going to worry about the delta at the moment here. This is what's called our game loop. And essentially, in game design, there's lots of things going on at the same time. You've got a player there, you've probably got a bunch of enemies, you may have animations playing, you've got things happening all over the place. And in traditional programming, you give a set of instructions to the computer. It starts at the top and it works its way down to the bottom. And it just does everything in order, one at a time, really, really fast if you can. But in game design, it's a bit problematic because we have lots of things going on really at the same time. So the player's jumping, the enemy's moving, the animation's falling, the boss is sending out missiles. There's all sorts of stuff happening all the time. So we have this game loop. Basically, it's ripping through, executing code for this one really, really quickly, and everything else is doing the same thing. So 60 times per second, we have this whatever happens here. Now, right now, you've got two words, pass and pass. That's because it wants some kind of instruction here. And right now it's saying, just don't do anything. But we're going to change that in a second, just to see how this programming works. In this case, we've got func ready. So let's see how that works. We can actually give an instruction to the computer to do something when this player's ready. So I'm going to try kind of the classic programming thing. We're going to display some words. I'm going to print, and then I put parentheses. And you'll notice that Godot tries to help you out. It finishes things off for you. It tries to make your typing and your world a lot easier. And if I want to print some words, I put them in quotation marks. So I'm going to say hello world. This is a very famous thing we do whenever we learn a new programming language, just to see how it works. So when the player's ready, it's going to print out the words hello world. So I am going to play my game here, see what happens. There's that player tucked up in the corner here because we're on the player scene, and I do not see the words hello world, but that's because the print statement is not, this is a game. It's not really designed just to display text on the screen, but instead we get a little output right here. So if you just move your window to the side, you can see there's this output window down here, and you can see it's printed out the words hello world. So in fact, it does what I told it to do. It's just displaying it down here for in this particular case. So as mentioned, notice it happens once, it just spits it out. Now, same idea as I mentioned down here. I'm just going to erase the pass and I'm going to paste print hello world. Now let's print something else here. Here is the game loop. So remember, this is going to happen 60 times a second. So if we play that, we move over, whoa, you can see lots of here is the game loop. And if I stop that, you can see, I can scroll back up, it has printed out a lot of here's the game loop. Right at the top here, we've got the hello world, and then 60 times per second, it's printed out hundreds of here is the game loop. So there's, first of all, some instructions. You have now controlled the computer a little bit. You've told it what to do, and it's doing it exactly as you mentioned. Not very interesting for our game, but we will get there in a hurry. So I can now, with these comments, I can delete them if I want. Often people find they get a little cluttered, and you want to keep your code clean as possible. So two sections, as mentioned, we've got this what's called func ready. Oh, and if it ever vanishes, there's a little drop down here so you can hide what's called a function. And a function is just kind of like a section of the program, if you will. So I would like to do something a little different because printing out just words is not going to be very useful in our game. But we can also have the computer do what the computer is supposed to do, which is some math. A computer is for computing. So I could print 50 times, we use the asterisk for times, 25 in here. And if we run that, you'll see because it's not in quotation marks, you'll notice it does the math for me. Now, remember, if I want to print out something exactly, like words or something, if I were to put it in quotation marks, you'll see that we actually get 50 times 25. It prints out that sentence. If it's not in quotation marks, it's going to do the actual calculations or computations for you. So that's great and all, but 50 times 25 is kind of locked in. So often we want to be able to change things. And you've probably done this in your math class. In math class, you've probably had some teacher give you like a let x equal 5 and y equal 10. What is x times y? It's a pretty common thing you've probably done in math at some point in time. And what I would like to do is these are called, we let x and y are called variables because they change. And computers are terrible at remembering things. They're really fast at doing things line by line. But if you want them to remember something that happened before, you have to tell them, hey, remember this, and please remember it here. So we also have variables in computer programming, and they are used for all sorts of things, like the position of the character, the score, the health, the lives. Anytime you want to remember something in the computer, you need to set up a variable and say, this is a box. I'm going to label the box, and I want you to put it in your memory. So to do that in computing, I'm going to say var, or in GD script, var for a new variable. And I'll just use that x as well. X is not a great name, but we'll use it for the time being. X equals 5. So on my first line, outside of everything here, I've said I want to make a new variable. It's going to be called x, and I'm going to let it equal to 5. Now down here, let's get that. I can also now just print out x. In fact, I could print out x plus 2. Oops. If I like. And you'll see that we now get 7 here because x is to the computer just 5. It goes and looks in the box that I labeled x up here and says, ooh, what is x? 5, 5 plus 2, and I'm going to spit that out. Also not very interesting at the moment, but we can do some cool things like, what if I say, I'm going to print out x plus 2, and then I'm going to change what x is. I'm going to say x equals whatever x was, so we'll call it x, plus 1. So the first instruction is print out x plus 2. That's 5 plus 2 is 7. And then the next line it says, okay, now I want you to make x equal to whatever x was, 5, plus 1. X is now 6. And remember, this is a loop, so it goes around and around and around. So the next time it comes around, it says, okay, print out x plus 2. Now it says, well, x actually now is 6. So 6 plus 2 is 8. And then it goes on and it increases it again. And 60 times a second, this is going to happen. So if we run our program, you'll see we get very quickly this counting up of numbers, and it's just going to go on forever and ever and ever, 60 times a second, adding 2 to x and printing, or adding 1 to x, and then printing out x plus 2. And you can see the numbers climbing up crazily very quickly, like so. So there is our first idea of variable, which is really, really powerful in programming and something we're going to need for our game design here. Because really, at the end, what I want to do is be able to move this character. And the reason we've introduced this idea of variables is that the character body 2D has some built-in variables to make life easier for us. Because the people who designed Godot said, hey, you've got a character, probably one of the common things you want to do with a character is to move a character. So it's come up with a system to make moving your character easier. And here's what I'd like to do. have a look at that. So from your math class again, and this is not math, but there's a lot of math involved in in computing. You'll know that we have kind of for algebra and geometry and moving things around and putting things in positions, we have this thing called the Cartesian coordinate plane. It's got an x, y axes. Usually we've got a bunch of movements here like this. And our positioning and our movement in game design is all based around this idea. So I've got something at whatever position it is, and if I want to move it, I can move it in the x direction, or I can move it in the y direction, or I can move it in both directions at the same time. So I could say that I want my player to move to the right 3 spaces. Well, I could say I want you to go to 3 in the x direction, but to make life a little quicker, we actually always give both of these things, x and y. So if I didn't want it to move up or down at all, I would say, well, I want you to move 0 in the y direction. And you've probably seen something like this in math. This is called, and it may be in your science class, this is called a vector. A vector is really just two coordinates or two numbers here to help us out with a direction and speed. Similarly, if I wanted to only move up or down, I could move 0 in the x direction and 3 in the y direction, and that would move up 3. If I moved 1, I would go a little bit slower. If I moved 10, I would move a little bit faster. Similarly, if I wanted to say move off at an angle like this, what I could do is give it a vector. 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2. I would say, player, I want you to move 3 in the x direction, 2 in the y direction. And this is a vector. And because we are working in 2 dimensions, remember Godot will also do 3D games, but because we're working in 2 dimensions, this is what we call a vector 2. And if I'm making a measurement or a number, unlike that 5 I had previously, I would give it vector 2, 3 comma 2. And that's how I would kind of specify that this player is going to move off at this angle, or straight, or up, or down, or what have you, just by changing the 2 numbers here. So let's look at that here. Now, I don't have to build that variable like I made my own variable here. Godot has already done it for me, and it's called it velocity. And I'll put it right in here. So what I want to do is I'm going to say the velocity, and notice it's trying to help me out as I start typing velocity. It does it, it finishes it for me, or it gives me all the options with velocity. So I'm going to say the velocity, you just hit enter, equals a vector 2. And notice vector is capitalized, 2 is right there. So the nice part is as you start typing it, Godot is going to help you out. And you can see there's a vector 2, vector 3, even a vector 4, which we'll get into maybe a lot later. So I want a new vector 2. And notice it still tries to help me. There's an X and a Y component to this. So let's say I want to make my player move to the right. And if I look here and I grab my little arrows here, you can see the X is this way. It's this red arrow. And it's moving to the right there. That means that's a positive movement there. Notice the green would be my Y. So actually, if I want to move down, that's also a positive number. So moving up is a negative. A little bit different than your math class, but you'll get used to that. And it's usually because the top corner of the screen is where we mark 0, 0, rather than the very middle of the page, because it's kind of hard to find the middle of your screen exactly. It's way easier to use that as a reference point. So going up in a negative direction, in a positive direction doesn't usually make much sense. You always want to go down, adding numbers here, adding numbers here. So back to my script here. So if I want to move to the right, I'm going to move, let's say, I'm going to start with 25, comma, so 25 in the x direction, and we'll move 0 in the y direction. So here we've just set the velocity. It's a built-in variable, so I didn't have to make it, to 25, 0. And when we set the speed, it's kind of saying, hey, get ready to go this speed. It's kind of revving its engine, and then you have to say, okay, go. And we have another instruction that's built into character body 2D called move and slide. And the move and slide is as I said, a function. It's an instruction that's built in to basically say, start moving whatever the velocity I told you to move was. That's the move part. The slide is kind of a nice feature of Godot in that, let's say I have, oh, I don't know, a platform here, and then there's a little ramp, and here's my player. The player is going to start moving exactly how I told it to, but if I hit something that's kind of like an incline or a slope, it'll actually follow that up. It'll slide up the thing, which is really, really nice. You can control later on how big that slope needs to be. So if you had a wall here, the player is going to go, it's just going to hit that wall and stop. It's only if it's at a slope that it slides up. So that's where that slide comes from. But we can get to that a little bit later. So I set the velocity, and then I said move and slide. And if we play our game now, you can see that the player is slowly moving to the right there. And if I wanted to move a little faster, I could use a bigger number. If I wanted to move it slower, I could use a smaller number here. Now notice we're playing the player scene, so it's starting up in the top corner. But I can also go back to my level 1, where you may remember it is in the middle, as that's its starting position. So I can now play that scene, and we'll see, there we go, that looks a little bit better. Obviously, that's way slower than I want if I'm going to be moving. Back here, notice we have now a script attached to that, and it's its own scene. If you want to quickly edit that script, you can just click on the script button. It'll bring it right up for you. So, maybe I want to move at 200. Move and slide. There we go. That is a little speedier movement. And if I wanted to move in the other direction, I could make it move negative x direction, like so. And maybe I just wanted to move up or down. Well, I could do negative 200 in the y direction. You get up, and obviously 200 in the y direction, we move down, like so. And if you wanted, you could make it move at some kind of angle. Maybe I'm going to go 150 in the x and 200 in the y, and you'll see we start to move off at different directions, like so. So play around, move that a little bit, and then in our next video, we'll look at how we can control that movement using our keyboard or something else like that.